Welcome to my book talk. Today I'm going to talk about my new book titled Queer Media in China. My name is Hongwei Bao. I'm an associate professor in media studies from University Nottingham, UK. So I'll briefly talk about the origin of the book and touch on some of the key themes of the book. I will then briefly introduce the structure of the book, and after that I'll open up the floor for discussion. So how did I get into this? So in 2001, when I was a university student at Peking University studying journalism and communication, so as a student of journalism, well, it was pretty much a difficult time to China because on the one hand, we were taught about all those, well, journalistic principles, but on the other, there were a lot of obstacles in China, professionally and politically, so that students trained in School of Journalism can't really actually exercise or what they have learned in real life. But at that time, one important thing occurred, which was that the first Beijing Queer Film Festival was held on Peking University campus. At that time, I was a student there, and I passed by the kind of triangle area, the poster bulletin board where the film posters are posted. I knew about the event, but I didn't actually go to the event, because to go to the event you have to pay about 5 yuan, which is actually very inexpensive, but for a university student that's still pretty high. Well, at that time I wanted to see one queer film called Lan Yu, and it happened that there were some piracy DVDs on sale on university campus. So since you can buy piracy DVD, and why do you bother to go to the Beijing Queer Film Festival? So that was a kind of missed opportunity between me and the Queer Film Festival. So I lived in Beijing between 2001 and 2006, and I knew there was a community out there, but as an ordinary queer person, well, one just want to get on with one's life and have a few friends and have a job and so on and so forth. So although there was a queer community, intentionally or unintentionally, detach myself from that community until in 2007 I went to Australia to study my PhD in gender and cultural studies. So at first I was doing a different topic, but then at that time Cui Zi'en, a famous Chinese queer filmmaker, were invited to the University Technology at Sydney, and Steffi Donald, a professor at UTS at the time, invited Cui to give a talk and film screenings, and I started to learn about the kind of independent Chinese queer film scene in China, and were absolutely amazed by Cui's films. So I'm interested in finding out more about China's queer films and queer activism. So I asked for Cui Zi'en's contact information, and a year later I went to Beijing to conduct my field work. So because of my entry into China's queer activism was through queer filmmakers and queer film festival, so a lot of my field work surrounding media activism, at that time I wasn't aware of it, but I attended Beijing Queer Film Festival, China Queer Film Festival tours, etc., and followed filmmakers to different parts of the country to see their film screenings and organizations, etc. So I was really impressed with, in a way, the capacity of film in connecting people, in building a community, in representing queer lives. and so on. So I wanted to write about this. But at that time, my kind of major identity was in kind of ethnographer. So my associate supervisor is an anthropologist. So essentially, so as a kind of half anthropologist and half cultural studies person, I started to document the different places and events that I've been to, including those queer film screening events. And in time, I found it was increasingly difficult actually to maintain my status as a kind of objective observer, because I was soon invited actually to chair sessions and to write for the kind of film columns and queer blogs and so on. So in a way, it was partly out of courtesy because a lot of people helped me at that time. So I can't just say no to everybody. I'm an objective observer. So I became actually increasingly involved in China's queer activism at the time through volunteering for different types of queer events. So that was basically how my PhD thesis came about, and the PhD thesis was called Queer Comrades, Gay Identity and Tongzhi Activism in Post-Socialist China, which later became my first book. So with my first book, I wanted actually to write about this queer history in China from 1980s to 90s, and my guiding question was that what is this Tongzhi identity? So Tongzhi is a Chinese indigenous term, or is one of the indigenous terms for queer or LGBTQ or gay in Chinese language. So I'm interested how this term came about and what does this term do. And that at that time, so the term Tongzhi, comrade, was primarily used in activism. So inevitably, so my account of the history or genealogy of Tongzhi surrounds queer activism. But after finishing that PhD thesis, I was left with a lot of questions, unanswered questions. So one of them was, when I talk about queer activism, what exactly is activism? So in my book, I talked about queer film festivals. I've also talked about a kind of confrontation between the police and gay men. I've also talked about Cuizi and avant-garde politics, etc. Are they the same thing? Which one is activism? If they are all activisms, what are their differences? So this is a remaining question that would take me to my second book, Queer China. So Queer China was pretty much a product from my PhD period to my my earlier career researcher period. So at that time, I'm interested in a lot of queer texts, such as queer fan fictions, novels, films, and art, and so on. So I put everything together and pretty much compiled this book called Queer China, Lesbian and Gay Literature and Visual Culture under Post-Socialism. So this is my attempt to write a queer cultural history, although it's a very selective and incomplete queer cultural history in post-Mao China. And through this event, I'm trying to think about what do those forms of cultural production do? Do they function like a form of queer activism? So the answer from me is yes, because in China, more explicit forms of queer activism, such as gay pride, etc., were very limited, and in a way, actually, the kind of political environment rendered them almost invisible or impossible. So in this sense, how did that kind of consciousness of being queer, being gay and lesbian emerge? So one of the biggest important factor, I argue, is the cultural production and consumption. So this is a book which basically argues for kind of soft activism or cultural activism, reflecting on the role of culture in constructing identities, communities, and politics. And I also argue that in this way, this form of activism is actually a kind of soft activism which constructs identities and deconstructs identities at the same time, because literary and visual cultures actually they may address identity politics, but there was enough room for identity politics to be challenged, to be rethought, to be reworked on. So that's the second book. But so far, the second book still hasn't answered one of my key questions, which is, what is the role of media in queer activism? This question became especially relevant when I became a associate professor, assistant professor in media studies, and everybody asked, since you teach media, what kind of media are you researching on? And I can argue that, oh yeah, of course I'm just talking about media studies, because basically I'm talking about representation, cultural production, etc. But what's media about the queer media and culture that I'm talking about? So these questions lead me to my third book, which is Queer Media in China. In fact, Queer Media in China probably follows my first book, Queer Comrades, more closely. So I realized that one book is not perfect, or there are some remaining questions left from one book. So the best thing is to write another book to kind of explain the situation, to make up for the kind of losses or negligence that I've made, and to make a stronger argument. So that's my attempt to make a stronger argument based on my first book. And I'm trying to think about those questions, such as, what is an identity? What does identity do? And what is a community? So if we are talking about community activism or community media, what does community do? And then there's also the notion of media. What's the role of media in queer activism in China? So I started actually a project about queer community media, that is LGBTQ use of media in China, within China's queer communities. So there are different ways to define queer media. Some are popular and commercial media, and others are kind of independent media, and there are also some which is about the kind of queer readings of mainstream cultural text. But my use of queer media is actually very specific. I am talking about queer community media, so which is media produced by LGBTQ people for the community use, and often for an activist purpose. So in a way, this is a book about queer media activism. So there's a question that is, why does this matter? Why do we have to look at China's queer media activism and queer community media? Well, this is in a way actually a book that is very much of its own time. So when I'm writing up this book, I'm in the middle of a pandemic last year, and so before the pandemic, so I'm thinking a lot about deconstructing identities and communities, thinking about them as oppressive. But entering into the pandemic, I've started actually to look at what forces identities can enable, and what kind of community care can we forge in a condition of emergency, or in neoliberal times where identities actually don't matter. So this is not an argument, a defense for identity politics. So I'm trying to pursue a kind of an identity critique without identity politics. In other words, I'm thinking about what can identities enable without reifying it, without objectifying it, and without essentializing it. So that's my, in a way, actually, my underpinning ideas. But meanwhile, I also have a kind of intellectual agenda, which is to challenge the dominant paradigms in queer media in media and communication studies, especially media and communication studies in the Chinese context. When talking about media, people either think about the kind of party-controlled media, or think about commercial media, and so on. So these are perfect, valid avenues of inquiries. However, so those arguments are mostly built on the kind of mass media paradigm, so where media are produced for a large majority of people with the purpose of either becoming the kind of mouthpiece of the political party or to make money, so as commercial enterprises. And queer community media mostly defy the logic because so they are not controlled by the political parties, and they often actually exist independently from mainstream productions, and nor are they produced to make money. So therefore those commercial incentives are not there. They are there actually to serve the communities by enthusiasts or community members to express their identities, feelings, and experiences, and to share those experiences with like-minded people. How do we understand this? So that's the entry point of queer community media. So with this in mind, I'm dividing the book into 4 parts or 4 sections. So section 1 is about historical and theoretical concept, where I introduce what is queer community media, why are they important, and I also use this space to trace a genealogy, or in this case an archaeology, of different queer community forms, from pages, telephone hotlines, queer zines, and early websites, etc., and to today's gay dating apps. So gay dating apps is probably one of the most important, most popular queer community media in China today. However, that's not the focus of my analysis, partly because a lot of scholars have already researched on this area. But another important reason is that I want to look back. So when everybody actually is fascinated by those new platform economies and dating apps, algorithm, governmentality, I'm interested in older forms of community media, in those kind of, if you like, two-dimensional and even pre-digital era. But as my focus is on queer filmmaking, so obviously I have to talk about the digital context. So in a way, it was the kind of popularity of digital media in China that has enabled queer media activism, because when everybody has access to mobile phone, when a lot of people have access to digital video cameras, they start to break the monopoly of the national television or national film studios and make stories or make films of their own. So that brings me to the second chapter, which is about queer filmmaking, in particular documentary filmmaking in China. And I call the independent queer documentarians the queer generation. So basically their films have a lot of similarities. So in this book, I primarily focus on queer documentaries and documentarians and the documentary-based queer activism. There are many reasons why documentary becomes a major form for queer activism, both in China and in the West. I think the digital affordance and the popularity of the kind of documentary format, as well as the kind of documentation function, that made it particularly important. So that's why that in the second part of the book, I talk about how documentaries facilitate the documentation of queer history. So using 2 examples. The first example is Cui Zien's film documenting Queer China, Comrade China. So this film offers a history of queer community queer community activism, so from the 1990s to pretty much 2008. So that through the analysis of that documentary, on the one hand, I want to give a brief history of queer activism in China, and on the other hand, point to the kind of technological affordances and media specificity of the documentary format in archiving and documenting queer history. And then this is followed by Shi Tou's documentary We Are Here, So We Are Here is a documentary made to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Beijing Women's Conference in 1995. So the two documentarians, Zhao Jing and Shi Tou, uses this documentary not only to trace a kind of women's history, but also to tell a kind of queer women's history. So in a way, this documentary deals with a complex relationship between feminism and queer activism in China, and between gender and sexuality in queer women's history. So this is a chapter that lays a foundation for the kind of the history of lesbian activism, but it also raises a question of the politics of representation and the politics of memory and narration. So that's the second one. So of course those documentaries document queer history, but they also make things happen. They also participate in social activism. So this is why that I move on to queer screen activism in part 3. So in part 3, I conduct 2 case studies. The first one is a community webcast called Queer Comrades. And the second one is Beijing Queer Film Festival, and I focus on the first 10 years, which is often known as the guerrilla war years of the Beijing Queer Film Festival. And I analyze how queer activism has been translated from international context to a kind of Chinese context, and how community health communication and activism are enabled by digital media practices. So that's part 3. And part 4 is a section that deals with international development. So in a way that I use this section to have conversation with international communication and development studies. So international communication and development studies focus on the kind of unequal power relations between the West and non-Western countries, between the global North and the global South. And there are a lot of developmental projects using the kind of participatory media communication. However, in using those, there are some pitfalls to avoid. So the lucky one, a documentary by He Xiaopei, really taps into the politics of narration when community activists use participatory documentaries or participatory video to empower marginalized groups. So when they empower marginalized groups, they sometimes risk actually depriving them of their own agency. So that's really about the politics of representation and participation. And then the last chapter takes queer activism from inside China to Africa, when Chinese queer filmmakers and African queer filmmakers, primarily in Ghana and in Zimbabwe, collaborate on queer video making workshops. So they make films together and train local filmmakers. So through this practice, they imagine kind of queer transnationalism that doesn't serve the national interest, that are not recognized by either governments. However, this type of minor transnationalism are equally important and powerful for queer communities worldwide. So the kind of queer transnationalism is not only what flows from global north to global south, but it also engenders kind of rhizomatic queer connections within the global south. So overall, in putting together this book, so I'm doing a kind of archiving practice, building a queer community archive of queer films, media practices, and media activism. But at the same time, in putting up together this book, attending queer film festivals and helping filmmakers translating their film subtitles and organizing workshops and conferences, etc. So writing and researching also becomes a type of activist practice. So really drawing on the participatory action research, I imagine myself to be a kind of active researcher that constructs the kind of social world that I'm writing about with my writing and research practices. So that's a brief introduction to the book Queer Media in China. Thanks for listening, and questions and suggestions are welcome.